Yes, guys, another pre-season review in the bank here. Saints versus Blues at Icon Park, which took place on Saturday. I didn't see this one in the flesh, and it's one that I've had to go back and sort of retrospectively look at to kind of see all the performances. So I did hear some things before I watched this game. It was a pretty good one, a lot of interesting takeaways. Starting probably with Carlton, I think probably the biggest story here, just the fact that they've had another long-term injury, this time really unfortunate one with Jagger Smith going down with that knee injury that looked pretty innocuous. I think even the club came out and said after the game that it wasn't a serious injury, and it turned out he actually had done an ACL. So that's really disappointing for Jagger, really disappointing for Blues fans with what they sort of did in the trade period to kind of get up the board to take Jagger, who they wanted in the draft. So not good, and that's another one on the list for Carlton, and they seem to be dropping like flies to really important players. More recently, Nick Newman, who puts a massive dent in their sort of ball movement game that they're sort of trying to get going off the halfback. So I think that's still another narrative coming in for Carlton. Do they rely too heavily on that stoppage element of the game? And then for the Saints, I think they were really promising, particularly after quarter time. They got fairly heavily beaten at stoppages, but were able to work back into the game. And then we saw those players come into it like Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller. I thought Hugo Garcia was really strong from the midfield, as well as Hugh Boxall as a rookie player who could be in line for a starting position. So we'll go through all of that, starting with, as I usually do, just go through the players that were out of the team that sort of are going to affect the result to some level. And probably surprisingly here, the Saints definitely had a lot more key players out in this game. Max King, Ari Schoenmaker, Dougal Howard, Matthias Philippou, Liam Henry, Rowan Marshall, and Jack Sinclair are probably all of the first team walk-up starters that come straight into this team. Ari Schoenmaker is probably a 50-50 on that, but most of those guys come straight back into this St Kilda lineup. And for Carlton, they were pretty well full strength, but without Sam Walsh, obviously, in that midfield, and Charlie Curnow, who was obviously a big out for them in the forward half of the ground and puts a lot more weight on Harry Mackay's shoulders. And he had a pretty good game in this one. But if we sort of just, as I said off the top, if we sort of break down the game of how it went, I think Carlton were really strong at the beginning of the game. And this is something I've noticed watching Carlton over the last few seasons under Michael Voss. And the way that they've sort of built this team with a heavy midfield presence, they like to get big bodies in that midfield to try to dominate stoppage and sort of play this game similar to what I talked about with the Crows, with what they do with Riley O'Brien. The Blues have a player like Mark Pitnet, and he's one of those ruckmen, a little bit from an older generation, where he wins a lot of hit-outs to advantage. So he gives you first use in that midfield, but he doesn't offer a lot anywhere else on the ground. So if you play him, you have to have this stoppage dominance game, which Carlton, facilitated by players like Patrick Cripps and George Hewitt in there. Jagger Smith's come into the team. So they certainly have the players to play this game, but it can be difficult and perhaps unsustainable to play that way for 4 quarters. And we kind of saw that in this game with a first quarter dominance from stoppage, where they were able to score pretty heavily. I mean, they kicked 3 goals in the first quarter, but then the free-flowing, sort of freewheeling game of St Kilda with those ball movers off halfback started to take over from about the second quarter, and Carlton couldn't really keep up from there. So we'll talk about the Saints midfield group, which was pretty dense, I suppose, pretty condensed with those like similar type players. They had McRae, Garcia, Jack Steele is probably the primary 3, and then you had Hugh Boxall and Max Hall, I believe, had a few CBAs. I like some of the things he did. Wasn't taking too much notice or taking any like stats or information like that from this game. But McRae, Garcia, Steele, I'd be surprised if they weren't the 3 that are lining up in round 1. And I think what that does for St Kilda, it's pretty on brand for Ross Lyon, really, when you think about how he's ran midfields over the years. When he was at Fremantle, it was like Fife, it was Barlow, it was David Mundy, all guys over 190 centimetres. And here again, McRae, he probably doesn't play like a really tall midfielder, but he is pushing 190 centimetres. You've got Jack Steele, who's that bigger body in there. And then he's gone with Garcia as that sort of fast feet player, probably a loose ball dominant player, just to give them some nip and some bite in there as well. So I expect a massive year for Hugo Garcia. He was pretty prominent in this game as far as statistically. I think he crept forward at one point and kicked a really important goal too. So he's just He's so fleet of foot at stoppages, and then he hits the ball at pace, runs through, really dynamic. Doesn't sort of have like a lot of strength to his game, I suppose, but he doesn't really need it. Sort of more in the mold of like a Nick Dacos with the way that he moves at stoppage. So I think he's going to be super important. Again, I say on brand. Hugh Boxall, I think they've just sort of identified him as that big-bodied midfielder that can come in, probably play from day dot. It's a good story in the sense that Hugh Boxall, he's a later draft pick. He wasn't someone taken right at the top end, and he looks likely now to come in and start for this team. And I think what he does is just when McRae comes to the bench, when Steele comes to the bench, you can sort of put a like type in there because Boxall, he's got that physicality to his game. He's got that reach that Ross line teams like to have from midfield. And I think with McRae, with Steele, yes, this midfield is not going to score heavily from stoppage or anything like that, but with having a player like McRae come into the ranks, he's at least going to take a little bit of ball off the opposition, just getting his hands on it, creating a few repeat stoppages. St Kilda aren't going to be as leaky from those clearances like they have been in the last couple of seasons. So is the McRae pick for me massively moving the needle? Like, absolutely not. But I think he's going to come in there and he's going to get high disposal and just be a placeholder until they bring players like Philippou back and they have a bit more dynamism in that midfield. I mentioned Max Hall. I thought he played really well, and I think he is certainly an upgrade on some of those players that they've had in there recently, like a Brad Crouch, even someone like a Zach Jones as well. I think just getting some fresh faces with a little bit more to them physically, I think that's really going to help out the Saints. From a wing point of view, they continued to play Bradley Hill through there, who I think is really good. He just runs up and down all day. His ball use is brilliant. Probably not getting as much of the footy as he was a few years ago, but I think he's still a really reliable player. And with his athleticism and the levels that he can run, it just creates problems for the opposition there when you're on transition and he just continues to continues to come to that D50 to receive the ball. And the kicking inside 50 and the way that he can sort of overlap. And this is what I'm excited about for St Kilda mostly, I think. The players like Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller, like Jack Sinclair, they've been pushing a player like Angus Hasty back there, and it's very modular and they can sort of overlap with each other, push forward, and then you can, finally get the ball in the hands of someone like Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller to kick the ball inside 50. I'm jumping ahead of their team a bit too much here. I was happy with Bradley Hill, though. Darcy Wilson sort of doing the job on the other side, and then Toby Travalia came on late, and we got to see some of the running power of him. So definitely an area in recruitment that St Kilda have gone for heavily with bringing in a player like Bradley Hill, who's an awesome 2K time trialer. He's a really good endurance athlete. Toby Travalia, Darcy Wilson, both the same. So there's not many teams in the AFL that have the standards of the wingers that St Kilda have at the moment. So I'm really excited about what they can do along with the halfbacks that I mentioned. The forward line, probably an area a little bit of concern for the Saints and just how that's going to look. I mentioned they had Max King out of the side, which obviously leaves a bit of a hole, but Cooper Sharman looks really, really good coming into this season. There are a couple of moments where he just presented up at the ball. Aerially, he just makes a really good contest, but what I was impressed with was with his ground level work. He was able to hit the ball at pace at times. There was one moment, might have been in the second term, where he crumbed a pack. I thought it was actually Jack Higgins straight off the bat because just how much pace he hit this ball at, picked it up and then gave a handball off and they kicked the goal. But he's really exciting. And if he can have a big season and you can get Max King fit, then you've got a really nice 1-2 punch there. And you can play Mitch Owens as that third tall, the one that comes up higher, a little bit higher up the ground. And again, he gets that weaker defender and he can just create problems for the opposition. Mitch Owens, we know, can be a player that can even go into the midfield and impact with his power as well. Community played forward in this game, and he's one that's was touted earlier in the preseason as playing in defence, but it looks like Ross Lyon wants to play him as a forward. He's probably the one for me that misses out if you've got Cooper Sharman there and you've got Max King playing as the number 1 and number 2. Higgins played as that small forward. He does that really well playing deep. Marcus Windhager at times, less so in the centre bounce in this game. I didn't see him at all in the centre bounces, but he was coming up to stoppage as that high half forward. And again, another player with elite endurance to him that can come up and fulfill those roles. So St Kilda obviously wanting to create those overloads on the opposition through running, through players like Marcus Windhager. They had Butler in there who kind of just operates at this point as a pressure forward. You do really notice when he gets ball in hand that he struggles to hit targets. And that's difficult for a high half forward because you are getting, you're picking up the ball pretty high, close to goal, and you want to make good decisions. Butler's probably not there, but he does give a little bit of leadership and he does give that pressure. He'll be 50-50 for me if he actually makes it into the round 1 team. Burns, the other one. And I think if you've got Windhager and Burns operating off those 2 flanks, you get a lot of high-end running ability there. From a defensive point of view, Wilkie and Cordy back there. Now, Cordy, I think he's going to have trouble when he comes up against... we saw what Harry Mackay did for periods in this game, some of the contested marking. Harry Mackay can make good defenders look pretty poor like that. But it is interesting now that Battle's gone, they are just sort of one more defender short. Cordy's going to have to do some, have some big jobs this season and play really well. Wilkie does what he does. I think he's one of the best defenders, best intercepting defenders in the competition, and he's really good one-on-one as well. The player, and I didn't mention him there, it was coming off a wing. I'll just go back a little bit to the players that were playing off the wing that I've got written down here, but O'Connell was absolutely awesome. He's a Cat B rookie, apparently from a couple of years ago from Ireland. He looked really good. And again, they've gone to the recruiting phase of the team and they've looked for someone that can and again, they've gone to the draft, they've gone to recruiting players that can run, and O'Connell is another one that fits that perfectly. And he was problematic for the opposition with his size, around 190 centimetres. So he was impacting aerially. He was drifting into those pockets of space around the half forward line, and just, those sort of later runs inside 50 where the ball's sort of bobbing around, the smalls get involved, and he was just arriving late and he can hit the scoreboard. So impressed with what he did. From a small defending point of view is where some of those players that didn't play in this game, I think, are going to come into consideration. Nasiah Wanganeen-Miller, what a player. He is going to be such a threat. He's not one of those players that gets 30 touches per game, but he doesn't need to. He's like a 20-touch guy, so lethal, so dangerous, and you want him, St Kilda want him receiving the ball as high as they possibly can. Now, he's obviously, with his running ability and the foot skills that he has, he's probably going to take some kick-ins and stuff like that and play really deep, but he's also going to get the ball high, and that's where players like Brad Hill, Toby Travaglia that are playing those wings, even O'Connell that I just mentioned, they can sort of flip back, do the defensive duties for him, and that gives him the ability to play forward and be really dangerous. Webster there is at lockdown. He's another one, similar vein to Butler. They're sort of a bit older players. They are defensively stable, and I think that's why Webster comes in. He sort of plays that smaller lockdown, so I do expect him to be there. Probably coming off the bench and just giving St Kilda a little bit of leadership with this young team. Ball in hand, you don't want him to be getting too many touches in the game, but yeah, solid as a lockdown player. And Angus Hasty, probably a bit of an interesting one, and a watch if you're playing any of those fantasy games, anything like that, because he looked like they wanted to try to get him as that sort of smaller, medium interceptor type, and maybe he is the player that eventually phases someone like a Jimmy Webster out of the team if he can sort of lock down, take some intercepts. He didn't have a heap of the footy, but he was really good at just sort of floating across as that sort of extra and sort of surprising the offense of Carlton a little bit. Liam Stocker, again, he's going to be one back there that plays a bit more of a defensive role as well. We'll skip on to the Blues, who are a pretty big story, I think, for the preseason, just all of the injuries that they've had, I mentioned off the top. And I don't know, I've got some reservations about the way that they play and the way that they're going to be able to sustainably score throughout this season, particularly with the injury to Nick Newman. So you've got Pittonet there. Could Carlton, because of the injuries and I guess just those circumstances that have happened over the preseason, like is Walsh going to be back? Could they sort of change a little bit here and move Pittonet out of the side, not have that such a heavy reliance on the midfield group to win the ball from stoppages and have the control in the game that way, but just bring Tom de Koning in as that main ruckman and just have a little bit more chaos to the game. So getting the ball forward, trying to improve the game, improve the scoring from the back half as well with getting the ball in the hands of someone like an Adam Sard. I think that's something that Carlton really need to explore for this season. But I'll run through sort of the players that they have, and we can kind of talk about, anchor this to sort of the idea that which players are going to be in the best 23 come round one. So the midfield group, I guess similar to St Kilda, it was pretty straightforward with the players that they had in there. Pittonet, as I said, did the number one ruck role, and Tom de Koning was the pinch hitter. Cripps, Chera, Hewitt, and Doherty. So probably the only surprise there. The other three, Cripps, Chera, Hewitt, we sort of know what we get from them, and they're kind of a part of the group. The only other one that would go into that group would be Walsh. Is Doherty just playing, filling a hole there for Walsh, or is he actually going to play centre bounces? I think they try to get Doherty, manufacture it so that they can sort of flick the handballs around with the likes of Cripps and Chera and Hewitt, and they can get the ball into Doherty's hand, and he has that sort of penetration to his game, the kicking skills to sort of put the ball inside 50 for Curnow and Mackay. Cooper Lord ran through there, and I think he's going to play an important role, probably doing what someone like a Matthew Kennedy did last season, coming up off the as a high half forward at times and also running through the midfield. But this midfield for me, it just does look a little bit same. Like all of the players that they've recruited over the last few years have been a little bit similar. Cripps, a big-bodied midfielder, doesn't have a lot of pace. We know what he does. He's amazing. Chera's a little bit the same. He's just a bit one-dimensional. Hewitt, and then Doherty, not really a midfielder, someone with a little bit better foot skills than the others, I suppose. But again, do you really have the right mix and the different types of players running through that midfield? I don't know if it has that cut through of some of the best teams in the competition. Cooper Lord, another one, good endurance runner, but doesn't really have a lot of dynamism to his game. So I think that could be a worry. There's no one way to play, so I'm not writing off Carlton, but I think that could be found out a little bit this year if they're too reliant on that same sort of stoppage game and those same sorts of players. So the other one to mention in that group was Jagger Smith, who obviously now for the 2025 season is a no-go. He's going to be doing rehabilitation on that knee injury. He was coming up from the half-forward flank. And again, the type of player that Jagger is, he's not someone that can affect the game particularly well off a half-forward flank for me. He's a really heavy stoppage dominant player. So he's someone that can win the ball from the clearance situations, doesn't get a lot of those sort of uncontested possessions like some of the other midfielders that were, in that draft class as well. So similar types for Carlton. But obviously the team overall, particularly the spine of this team, is really strong. Looking at the wings, Blake Acres is a real A-grade winger for me, someone that can run, has good overhead abilities, a little bit taller than the average winger. As I said, he's got pace, he's got that ability to hit targets as well inside 50 that's really important. Lucas Camporelli was another one that came into the game, I think in the second half and did pretty well, kicked the goal, but I don't think he'll get around one spot when everybody is fit in this team, but he's probably someone sniffing around there at the moment. As far as the forwards, so it was Mackay and De Koning down there as sort of those two big key position forwards, and then the rest for Carlton really were just sort of, and this is another area for me, there's a lot of teams in this boat where I don't think they've drafted, they've created enough variance, I guess, in their list. I think Carlton are a perfect example of that. A lot of midfielders, a lot of teams have done this, so it's not just a criticism of Carlton, but you look at the small forwards and there's a lot of them playing in those small forward roles, but are any of them actually specialists at what they do? Jesse Motlop, for me, was probably the pick of those small forwards, particularly when he hits the ball at pace. He's that one that can play deeper, closer to goal. He's very clinical, and his movement is really unpredictable for the opposition. So he was great. Zach Williams, he's good football. I don't know if he's really there as a small forward. He had some big games last season. I'm not sure that he's going to be able to back that up this season. Fantasia, he was good in this game, and he could be a wild card. But with what, the problems that he's had over a long period with his body, I don't know if you'd be wanting to rely on him. Moya's the wild card, the big wild card for this team. If he could turn himself into a Jordan De Goey, Dustin Martin type, half forward midfielder type player, that would be massive for Carlton. He's probably one with the talent level to be able to do it. But for me, watching this game, I don't think he's ready for that. I don't think he's ready to be that sort of pod player, that big game player yet. And then you've got sort of your worker bee types that, Fogarty, Cottrell, those sorts of players, they're really important to the system and defending high up the field. They come in and, sort of invert and fill roles defensively as well to stop the other team trying to transition the ball out of defense. But yeah, then you've got, I mentioned Jagger Smith. You've got Durden, who's probably not a real A-grade small forward, but he puts pressure on. Can he fit in? And then Elijah Hollands is that other one that plays that high half forward role as well. So it's really hard for me to absolutely predict what the Carlton best 23 is going to be. You look at those players. I don't think Fantasia gets in. Moya's touch and go. And then you're looking at players like Fogarty, Cotterill, Elijah Hollands probably as those high half forwards. Is there enough talent in there from a pure small forward, those roles, that modern roles for the high half forward? I'm not too sure. From a defensive point of view, they've got an absolute star in Wiedering. Then you've got Young and Binns. They're probably, Young's a really good player. I do think he is good enough as a second tall. And then you've got Binns. It's getting lower there. And then I don't know about the halfbacks. I'm really not sure about this Ollie Hollands experiment. He's sort of playing across there. I don't think he's really looks comfortable with ball in hand at the moment when he gets the ball off half back, which is problematic. Cowan looks really good, and I love the physicality that he brings as a modern day half back that can play on those medium and smalls, and also how he can run the ball out of defense, really dynamic, is brilliant. And Saad's probably the best kicker out of those guys from halfback, but he doesn't seem to get a lot of ball in hand. So interesting times for Carlton. I predict them overall of all of the teams that were in the finals last year. For me, they're the team that probably drops off if they can get massive seasons out of those stars. Like if Jacob Wiedering holds up and plays a full season, Patrick Cripps is going to have to do what he does. Kernow, Mackay, big seasons. That spine of the team is really strong, so it probably holds them. They're not going to absolutely collapse Carlton with that sort of quality in the team, but it's what's around that for me. I still think there's a lot of holes and probably just a lack of talent when you compare them to the teams like GWS, like Brisbane, those sorts of caliber teams. So that is a wrap for the video. It was a good preseason hit out between the Saints and the Blues. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.